The night was calm, wrapped in soft rain and the hum of thunder in the distance. The small Oregon town was fast asleep, but inside her quiet house, Clara Benson lay wide awake. The clock on her bedside table showed 11:47 p.m. She turned to the empty side of the bed where her husband, David, should have been. The sheets were cold. He had been gone for 3 weeks on another business trip, a phrase that had started to sound like an excuse more than a reason. Clara sighed and pulled the blanket closer. The soft tapping of the rain against the window filled the silence that had become her constant companion. Once she loved the peace of nights like this, but now it only made her feel the space between what she had and what she wanted. She tried to close her eyes, hoping sleep would drown her thoughts. But it didn't. She thought about how distant David had been lately, how his phone calls had turned short and polite, how his laughter seemed to belong to another life. She rolled onto her side, trying not to think. Just as her breathing began to slow, she heard something, a soft creak. The door. Her heart gave a small jump. For a second, she thought it might be the wind. But then a low voice broke through the dark. "Aunt Clara, are you awake?" It was Ethan, her 25-year-old nephew. Clara blinked and sat up, her sleepy eyes adjusting to the dim light. A tall, broad-shouldered figure stood in the doorway, his outline faintly lit by the hallway's glow. He looked hesitant, like someone unsure if they were welcome. "Ethan?" she said, her voice still thick from sleep. "It's late. What's wrong?" He stepped into the room slowly. His hair was damp and the sleeves of his sweatshirt were wet from the rain. "I couldn't sleep," he said quietly. I just needed to talk." Clara motioned to the chair near the window. "Come in." "Sit down." Ethan nodded and sat, his movements heavy as though the air itself carried weight. Clara switched on the bedside lamp. The light revealed the exhaustion on his face, dark circles under his eyes, a tiredness that didn't belong to youth. He had come to live with her 2 weeks ago after losing his job in Portland and ending a long-term relationship. Clara had offered him a place until he could get back on his feet. He had been polite, reserved, always helpful around the house. But tonight he looked different, lost. She studied him quietly for a moment before asking, "Did something happen?" He hesitated, then ran a hand through his hair. "It's just, everything's falling apart," he said softly. "I thought moving here would help. I thought I'd feel better. But every night I just think too much." Clara's heart softened. She recognized that kind of tired voice. It was the sound of someone holding themselves together because they had no other choice. She knew it well. "You've had a hard year," she said gently. "It's okay to feel lost. Everyone does at some point." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes full of something she couldn't quite read. Pain, confusion, maybe gratitude. "I didn't want to wake you," he murmured. I didn't know where else to go." Clara smiled faintly. "You're fine. I wasn't really sleeping anyway." He let out a breath, leaning back in the chair. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the rain filled the room again, steady and comforting. It reminded Clara of nights long ago when she was young and uncertain about the world. Before marriage, before distance, before the quiet had turned cold. "Do you ever feel like you're invisible?" Ethan asked suddenly. "Like you're there, but no one really sees you?" Clara froze. His question hit closer than he could know. She thought of David, how their conversations had become schedules, their dinners replaced with text messages. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said softly. "More often than I'd like to admit." Ethan looked at her with a kind of understanding that startled her. "You shouldn't," he said, his tone firmer now. "You've been nothing but kind to everyone. You deserve better than to feel invisible." The words caught her off guard. It had been a long time since anyone said something like that to her. She didn't know what to reply. She just looked at him, really looked at the sincerity in his eyes, the sadness behind his attempt to be strong. Something about his presence felt strangely comforting. The silence between them grew softer, like a shared breath in the dark. Then Clara shook her head lightly, trying to steady herself. "You're sweet to say that," she said, "but you should rest. Tomorrow's a new day. Ethan nodded, though he didn't move right away. Yeah, he said quietly. I just didn't want to be alone tonight. His honesty touched her. She wanted to tell him she understood that loneliness could be heavier than anyone admitted. But she didn't. Instead, she offered a small smile and said, You're never alone here, Ethan. Remember that? He gave her a grateful look, stood up slowly, and walked toward the door. Just before stepping out, he paused and turned back. Good night, Aunt Clara, he said softly. Good night, she replied. The door closed gently behind him, leaving Clara alone again in the warm, dim light. She leaned back against her pillows and stared at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but her heart wasn't. Something about that moment lingered, the way he had looked at her. Sadness in his voice, the strange warmth that had passed between them. She didn't want to think too deeply about it, but she couldn't help it. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way. Not with pity, not with distance, but with real care. She turned off the lamp and lay back down. But sleep refused to come. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle outside, and the sound seemed to echo her thoughts. She remembered the early years of her marriage. How David used to surprise her with flowers. How they'd talk late into the night about dreams and plans. But over time, life had changed. The laughter faded first. Then the warmth. Then the closeness. Now there was only silence. And in that silence tonight, she had seen something unexpected. Comfort. Not from the man who had promised to love her, but from someone who simply cared enough to knock on her door. She closed her eyes. Not with guilt or confusion, but with a quiet ache she didn't understand yet. She knew something had shifted, not in a scandalous way, but in the kind of emotional way that changes people. The loneliness she had been carrying didn't feel as heavy anymore. But that scared her even more. When the morning light began to creep through the curtains, Clara was still awake, listening to the soft hum of dawn. She didn't know what the next day would bring, only that something inside her had awakened. Something she thought had been lost long ago. And though she didn't realize it yet, that single, quiet night, the one that began with a soft knock on her door, would mark the beginning of everything that followed. The next evening came with a strange stillness that settled over the house. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a cold mist that clung to the windows. Clara Benson stood in the kitchen, drying dishes one by one, lost in thought. She had barely slept the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan's tired face and heard his quiet words. You're not invisible. She tried to shake it off. He was her nephew, after all. A kind young man going through a hard time. She shouldn't overthink it. But something about that moment between them had touched a part of her she hadn't felt in years. The part that still longed to be seen, to be heard, to be cared for. The clock struck 9. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Ethan had been in his room most of the day working on job applications. Clara admired his determination. She also sensed the sadness behind his polite smile. When she finished cleaning up, she poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the fireplace. The warmth felt comforting against the chill that had settled in her chest. Just as she began to relax, there was a soft knock on the doorway. Hey, Ethan said, stepping into the living room. Can I sit here for a bit? Clara nodded. Of course. It's your home too. He smiled faintly and sat on the couch across from her. For a few moments, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence between them. You didn't sleep much last night either, did you? Ethan finally asked. Clara looked at him, surprised. No. How did you know? He shrugged. I heard you moving around early this morning. I guess we both had a lot on our minds. She gave a small smile. Seems like it. He leaned back, staring into the flames. I keep thinking about my mistakes, he said. I keep asking myself where I went wrong. Losing my job, losing Claire. It's like everything I built fell apart all at once. Clara listened quietly. She knew that kind of heartbreak. The feeling that life had slipped through your fingers while you were too busy trying to hold it together. You didn't fail, she said softly. You just hit a rough patch. Everyone does. Ethan shook his head. It's more than that. I feel like I don't belong anywhere anymore. My parents barely call. My friends moved on, and now I'm here, feeling like a kid again. Clara set her tea down and leaned forward. You're not a burden, Ethan. You're family. You're doing your best, and that's enough. Her voice was warm, steady, the kind of voice that could calm storms. Ethan looked up, his eyes searching hers. You always know what to say, he murmured. I don't think I've ever really said thank you for letting me stay. She smiled softly. You don't need to thank me. I'm glad you're here. Something about her tone made his expression soften. You remind me of my mom, he said quietly. Not in a weird way, just you make people feel safe. Clara laughed lightly. That's a nice thing to say. I don't hear that often these days. He hesitated. You should. You're really kind, Aunt Clara. I mean, you're beautiful too, but you don't seem to see it. The compliment caught her off guard. For a second, her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't used to hearing words like that anymore. Not from David, not from anyone. She felt warmth rush to her cheeks, but quickly looked away, pretending to adjust her teacup. That's very sweet, Ethan, she said quietly. But you should focus on yourself right now. You've got a bright future ahead. He nodded, though his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer. I just don't want to mess things up again, he said. I keep replaying everything in my head, the fights, the things I should have said to Claire. I loved her, but maybe she didn't love me the same way. Clara's heart ached for him. She remembered the pain of realizing someone you loved had stopped trying. Sometimes love changes, she said. Sometimes people grow apart. That doesn't mean it was meaningless. It just means it ran its course. Ethan stared into the fire again. Do you ever feel like that with Uncle David? The question hit harder than she expected. Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at the flickering flames, the shadows moving across the room. Sometimes, she admitted, marriage isn't always easy. We've had good years, and some not so good ones. He nodded slowly. You deserve someone who makes you happy, he said. The sincerity in his voice caught her by surprise. She looked at him, really looked. His face was calm, but his eyes were filled with something deep and unspoken. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The fire crackled, the rain started again outside. And the space between them felt charged, not with desire, but with a strange connection neither expected. It wasn't about age or circumstance. It was about two lonely souls who finally felt seen. Clara blinked and looked away. It's getting late, she said softly. You should get some rest. Ethan hesitated but finally nodded. Yeah, I guess you're right. He stood up and took a step toward the hallway. Then he paused and turned back, his expression gentle. Thanks for listening. You make things feel lighter. She smiled faintly. That's what family's for. He left quietly, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. Clara sat by the fire for a long time after that, her thoughts tangled. His words echoed in her mind. You deserve someone who makes you happy. It wasn't a romantic thought, not in the way stories tell it. It was deeper than that. It reminded her that she had spent years trying to be everything for everyone else. A wife, a caretaker, steady presence while forgetting what it felt like to simply be wanted, appreciated, or seen. She realized then how empty her marriage had become. David's calls had grown shorter, his visits fewer. He never asked about her days anymore. Their home had turned into a house, neat, functional, but hollow. As the fire burned lower, she thought about Ethan again, not as a man, but as a reminder. A reminder that kindness could still reach her heart, that she wasn't invisible, that maybe she still had something to offer beyond the walls of routine. When the clock struck midnight, she finally stood and turned off the light. Her reflection in the window caught her eye. The tired lines on her face, the faint smile that hadn't been there before. She whispered to herself, maybe it's time to start living again. Upstairs, Ethan lay awake too, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't stop thinking about the warmth in her voice, the way she had listened without judgment. He hadn't meant to say so much, but somehow with her it felt safe. In that quiet house, two lonely hearts found a fragile kind of peace. Not love, not yet. But something real enough to make the darkness feel less heavy. Neither knew that their late-night talk would lead them both to choices and feelings they never planned for. But for now, as the rain whispered outside, it was enough that they weren't alone anymore. The next morning began quietly. With sunlight sneaking through the thin curtains and settling over the kitchen table, Clara Benson moved slowly as she brewed her coffee, trying to push away the heavy thoughts that had followed her since last night. Her heart still felt full of questions about Ethan, about David, Kay, and about herself. Ethan had gone out early for a jog, something he'd started doing to clear his head. Clara admired that. He was trying to rebuild his life one step at a time. But for her, it wasn't that simple. The emptiness in her marriage wasn't something that could be fixed with a run or a smile. It was something that had been breaking piece by piece over years of distance and silence. As she sat with her mug in hand, she noticed a stack of unopened mail on the counter. She began sorting through the envelopes, bills, advertisements, a magazine, until one letter caught her eye. It was from David. His handwriting was neat and familiar. But there was something cold about the way her name was written. Her chest tightened as she tore it open. The words inside changed everything. "Clara, I've been meaning to tell you this in person, but it's unfair to keep pretending. I've met someone else. It wasn't planned and I didn't want it to happen, but it did. I can't keep living a lie. You deserve honesty, even if it hurts. I'll be staying in Seattle for now. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. Please believe that I never stopped caring about you, but things have changed." Clara's hand trembled. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She set the letter down, her breathing uneven. For a few seconds, she couldn't move. Her marriage, 15 years of shared laughter, memories, and effort had just ended in a single page. She sat there in silence, the sound of the clock ticking painfully loud. A rush of memories flooded her mind. Their wedding day, the first house they bought, the promise that they would face everything together. And now that promise was gone. When Ethan came back from his jog, sweat on his forehead and earbuds still in his ears, he noticed immediately that something was wrong. "Aunt Clara," he asked softly, stepping closer. "What happened?" She didn't answer. She just handed him the letter. He read it slowly, and with each line, his jaw tightened. When he finished, he looked at her eyes filled with both anger and concern. He did this in a letter. He asked quietly. Clara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't even call. Ethan's hands curled into fists. "You don't deserve that. After everything you gave him." She looked away, wiping her tears. "People change, Ethan. Maybe I should have seen it coming." "No," he said firmly. "This isn't your fault." His tone was protective, almost fierce. Clara felt something in her chest shift. He sat down beside her, his presence steady, grounding. She had always been the one offering comfort. But now the roles were reversed. "I feel so foolish," she whispered. "All those nights I waited for his calls. All those excuses I believed." Ethan reached out carefully, resting his hand over hers. "You trusted someone you loved. That's not foolish. That's human." The warmth of his touch startled her, not because it was wrong, but because it felt safe. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed being held, being cared for. She pulled her hand away gently, trying to steady herself. "Thank you," she said. I need to think." Ethan nodded. "Take your time. I'll handle dinner tonight. You shouldn't worry about anything." She managed a faint smile, touched by his kindness. After he left, she walked out onto the porch. The afternoon light painted the world in gold, but her heart felt gray. She stared at the letter again, wondering when love had turned into silence, when promises had faded into apologies. That evening, Ethan made soup, simple, warm, comforting. He didn't talk much, but his presence filled the emptiness in the house. Clara tried to eat, though her appetite was gone. After dinner, he sat across from her at the table. "You know," he said slowly, "when Claire left me, I thought I'd never get over it. I felt worthless. But you helped me see that life doesn't end because someone stops loving you." Clara met his eyes, surprised. "And now you're the one reminding me," she said softly. He smiled, but there was sadness in it. You've always been stronger than you think. For a long time, they sat in silence, the air heavy with emotion. Clara studied him, the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet strength in his voice. He wasn't the broken boy who had arrived at her doorstep weeks ago. He was growing, healing, and somehow helping her heal to Dot later that night. When she went upstairs, she found herself pausing by his door. The light inside was still on. She could hear soft music playing. She wanted to thank him, to tell him how much his support meant. But she hesitated, afraid that the emotions she felt would spill into something she couldn't control. Instead, she went to her room, sat by the window, and opened her journal. Her pen moved slowly at first, then faster as the words poured out. Today I learned that love can end quietly. No shouting, no drama, just a letter. But even when someone walks away, life doesn't stop. Pain is proof that you cared. And maybe caring is still something beautiful. When she closed the book, she felt lighter, not healed, but no longer hollow. The days that followed were quiet but different. Clara began taking walks again, reading old books she'd forgotten she owned. Ethan was always around, fixing things, cooking, keeping the house alive. They talked often about work, about life, about moving forward. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the porch, Ethan said, "Do you think you'll ever forgive him?" Clara thought for a long time before answering. "I don't know, but forgiveness isn't for him. It's for me." He nodded, understanding. The last light of day touched her face, and for a brief moment, she looked peaceful, like someone who had finally accepted what couldn't be changed. But deep down, both knew the story wasn't finished. Something unspoken was still growing between them. Not a secret, not something wrong, but a quiet connection that came from shared pain and unexpected kindness that night. As the rain began again, Clara lay in bed listening to the soft rhythm on the roof. She no longer cried. Instead, she thought about the strange way life works, how endings sometimes bring people closer, how heartbreak can lead to unexpected hope. In another room, Ethan sat awake too, staring at the same rain through his window. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it, and somewhere in the space between them, between sorrow and comfort, loss and renewal, something fragile yet hopeful, the rain had stopped by dawn, leaving behind a soft mist over the Oregon hills. The air smelled fresh, the kind of clean stillness that follows a night of heavy storms. Inside the Benson house, everything felt strangely calm. Clara stood by the window in her robe, holding a cup of coffee, staring at the wet garden below. She looked tired but peaceful, like someone who had cried enough and was ready to start again. It had been 2 days since she received David's letter. 2 days since her old life quietly ended. The pain was still there, but something inside her had changed. Instead of feeling broken, she felt awake, like she could finally see her life for what it was. Not a failure, but a lesson. She took a deep breath, watching sunlight break through the clouds. The light touched the wet grass and the flowers Ethan had planted last week. That simple sight, life blooming after rain, made her smile. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Ethan walked into the kitchen, his hair messy, wearing a soft gray sweater. He looked at her with gentle concern. "Morning," he said quietly. "How are you feeling?" Clara gave a small smile. "Better than yesterday." He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "You slept." "Not much," she admitted. "But I think I'm finally done crying." He nodded. "Good. You deserve some peace." There was a warm silence between them, broken only by the sound of the coffee maker. Clara looked at him and said, "You've been so kind, Ethan. I don't know what I would have done without you this week." He smiled softly. "You've done plenty for me. I'm just returning the favor." Clara's eyes softened. "You've grown so much since you got here. When you arrived, you looked lost. Now you're different." He chuckled lightly. "Maybe we both changed." They shared a quiet laugh, and for a moment, everything felt easy. Clara hadn't laughed like that in months. It wasn't joy exactly, it was relief. Relief that she could still feel human, still connect with someone. After breakfast, Ethan went outside to repair part of the fence that had fallen during the storm. Clara watched from the porch as he worked, sleeves rolled up, focused, and determined. It reminded her of her younger days, when life was simple and every problem felt fixable. She admired how calm he was, how patient. When he finished, she handed him a glass of lemonade. "You didn't have to do all this," she said. He smiled, wiping his forehead. "I wanted to. This house deserves some care, and so do you." His words made her heart warm again. She looked down to hide it. "You always know how to say the right thing." "Just say what I mean," he replied. They sat together on the porch, watching the sky slowly clear. A cool wind brushed across the yard. It felt like the world was washing itself clean. After a long silence, Ethan spoke again. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He hesitated. "When you read that letter from Uncle David, were you angry?" Clara thought for a moment. "I was, but not for long. Anger fades when you realize holding on to it only hurts you more. I think I'm more disappointed than anything else." Ethan nodded. "I get that. That's how I felt when Claire left me. Not angry, just empty." Clara looked at him with quiet sympathy. Empty doesn't last forever. One day you wake up and realize it hurts less. He met her gaze and smiled faintly. "Has that day come for you?" She looked out at the horizon. "Maybe today's the start of it." The honesty between them felt warm and real. Not romantic, not dramatic, just human. They didn't need to say much. Sometimes silence said everything. That evening, as the sun began to set, the house was filled with a soft orange glow. Clara decided to cook dinner, a simple meal, something comforting. Ethan helped her chop vegetables, and their laughter echoed through the kitchen. For a while, it felt like family again, not the one broken by distance and betrayal, but the kind built on care and understanding. When they sat down to eat, Clara looked at him and said, "You know, when you first came here, I thought I'd be helping you. But I think you're the one who's helped me more." Ethan smiled shyly. "Then I guess we saved each other." Those words stayed with her all night. We saved each other. They were simple but true. Later, after dinner, they sat by the fireplace. The rain had returned soft this time, almost soothing. The room was dim, and the air was filled with the smell of wood smoke and rain. Ethan looked at her and said, "You should do something for yourself. Go somewhere new. Start fresh." Clara nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that. Maybe I'll visit my sister in California. I used to love the ocean." "You should," he said, his tone encouraging. "You've spent years taking care of everyone else. It's time to take care of you." She looked at him gratefully. "You sound older than your age sometimes." He laughed. "Pain teaches fast." The firelight flickered on their faces, and in that quiet space, something peaceful settled between them. It wasn't the tension of unspoken desire anymore. It was understanding, respect, and something like love, but not romantic love. It was the kind of bond that comes from two souls who've walked through pain and found light in each other's company. When it grew late, Clara stood and said softly, "I'm going to turn in. Thank you for being here." Ethan stood too. "Always," he said gently. As she walked away, she felt his gaze on her, not in longing, but in quiet respect. It was enough. The next morning, Clara woke early. The house was filled with golden sunlight, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the ache of emptiness. She made 2 cups of coffee and stepped outside. Ethan joined her a few minutes later, wearing that same easy smile. They stood on the porch in silence, sipping coffee and watching the mist rise from the fields. The world felt new again. Clara turned to him and said, "Ethan, I've decided something. I'm going to sell the house." He looked surprised. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said firmly. "I need a new beginning. I can't heal here. Too many memories." He nodded. "That's brave, Aunt Clara." She smiled. "No, it's just time." They stood there for a long while, the sound of birds returning after the storm filling the air. Clara felt light, not because the pain had disappeared, but because she had accepted it. Later that day, she sat down with her journal again. She wrote slowly, letting her words carry her truth. Sometimes love doesn't end in flames. Sometimes it fades quietly, leaving you in the ashes with nothing but lessons. But from those ashes, new life begins. People, moments, hope. I thought my story ended with heartbreak, but maybe it's just beginning with peace. She closed the book, her eyes calm. Outside, Ethan was working in the garden, humming softly. She smiled as she watched him, not with longing, but gratitude. That night, when she turned off the lights, she whispered into the dark, "Thank you." Ethan, it wasn't just for his help or kindness. It was for reminding her that even after betrayal, the heart could still heal, trust, and feel alive again. And as rain began to fall once more, soft and cleansing, Clara finally drifted into sleep, no longer haunted by the past, but quietly hopeful for whatever came next.